on the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello everybody, we are on the road today in Los Angeles. I had the great fortune to sit down with my old friend John Taplin. Taplin, of course, was Bob Dylan's tour manager in the early 60s. He was also the producer of the great Scorcese movie Mean Streets. So in my conversation with John, I began by asking him about the impact of the 1960s on contemporary America. John, are we still in a hangover from the 1960s? 60 years of hangover?
Well, we're certainly in a hangover in the sense that our country is in a kind of crisis mode. I would argue that maybe the real origins of the most recent problems started in 1989. You know, you've heard me use the term interregnum before, and essentially what I mean by that is that the Italian philosopher Gramsci had this notion: the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, many morbid symptoms appear. So what he meant was that that societies go through transition points, and the old way of life is desperately trying to hold on, and the new vision of the future can't seem to get into gear. And so what I think happened in 1989 are essentially four things that changed America. The first was obviously that the Berlin Wall came down. And so we had lived since my whole life, you know, since the late 40s, in this kind of Cold War notion that we were in this epic battle between us and the Russians. And then all of a sudden that just disappeared. And so the whole rationale for the military-industrial complex kind of went away. But of course, the people who run the military-industrial complex were not in the least bit interested in having it go away. It was the biggest gravy train in the world, and the fact that we were spending 54% of our discretionary budget every year on weapons. So the second thing that happened was that at CERN, this notion of the World Wide Web was created at a laboratory in Switzerland. And so in that sense, that created this brand new communication system. And you know, the initial ideas of it were incredibly utopian. I mean, I happened to be lucky enough to know some of the people who were involved in the really early stages of that, whether it's Vint Cerf or others, who were building the protocols that made all this possible. And their theory was, you know, there's a monopoly in communications. You know, in 69 or 79 or even 85, there were 3 television networks, and that was basically it. And a newspaper in your town. And so somehow they thought Well, all we have to do is create this platform where everybody can talk and everybody has a microphone and everything will be hunky-dory. Well, that turned out to be a complete cock-up. That was not true, and everything that we've seen since has proven that that's not true. The third thing that happened was that James Hansen, who was a scientist at NASA, testified in front of Al Gore's Senate committee that there was this thing called global warming, and it was going to become incredibly important, and it was going to change the world. And although Al Gore believed it, nobody else believed it. And in fact, you know, the Bush administration tried to get Hansen to change his testimony before he testified to Gore. So you got that factor. And then the fourth thing was, of course, that Reagan decided to get rid of what was called the fairness doctrine, which was this rule that the FCC had that you had to put on both sides of an issue if you were a broadcaster. And once they get rid of that, then you get Rush Limbaugh, then you get Fox News, then you get highly partisan media, and today, needless to say, it's very possible for people to live in alternative media universes. And this notion that there's alternative universes doesn't mean that they're both equally true. One is actually true, and the other is a complete fantasy. The idea that Donald Trump won the election in 2020 is a fantasy. But you were able to get 70% of the Republican Party to believe it's true because you have an alternative media universe. So in that sense, I do believe that we're hung over in the sense that we've never escaped that trap of these four issues. Why are we spending 54% of our discretionary income on weapons? Why is this media platform not under some kind of control, i.e. the internet? You know, why aren't we doing anything about global warming when we had since '89 to do something about it, and we haven't done anything? And then fourth is this media system that we have that's out there where Fox News can put out anything they want and say that has no basis in truth, and only if they defame a company like, you know, a voting machines company do they get called to task for it. And then needless to say, Elon Musk is never going to get called to task for defaming people or saying untruth because he's protected by, you know, Section 230, you know, safe harbor media laws, which were invented by, unfortunately, Al Gore and Bill Clinton.
John, much of that, of course, is true, but as perhaps a more cynical view of what's happened since the 60s is your generation, they didn't die, and maybe Keith Moon did, but the other members of the Who are old men now, very wealthy, very powerful. And your entire generation grew up. You became enormously successful, very wealthy. You're a good example of that. And you now, not you personally, John Taplin, but your generation, the 60s generation, has too much power, and you haven't really passed it down to younger people.
Totally agree. Totally agree. We're a gerontocracy, and it's disgusting. The fact that you know, Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden and, you know, Mitch McConnell and all these people are still in power is ridiculous. And, you know, quite honestly, the Jamie Dimon and Warren Buffett and all those people who are still in power is equally ridiculous in the corporate world. No, look, my generation has held on to power and has, you know, I mean, just look at a simple thing like taxes. Since 1983, there has not been a single bill passed in the Congress to raise taxes on millionaires. Yes, Obama let the Bush tax cuts expire, but he didn't put a new bill to raise taxes on you know, the rich. And so why is that? But that's because my generation holds 65 to 70% of the wealth in the country.
Trillions of dollars.
Yeah, and we're not giving it up. You know, I think it's probably one of the most critical issues of the time.
Another thing you mentioned, the importance of Dylan and Springsteen and Scorsese, but all these people are still around. I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't be allowed to give concerts. I recently went to a Springsteen concert. I've been to a number of Dylan concerts recently. Dylan is perhaps a little more convincing than Springsteen. But why, and the Rolling Stones, of course, Paul McCartney are also good examples. Why are the cultural icons of the 60s, why are they still so powerful? Why do so many people still go to them? What's happened culturally?
Partially the problem is that the millennials don't have anything to say. You know,
John, are you really serious about that?
No, I'm saying what great music is coming out of the last 15 years that will stay forever? You know, I'm sorry, but you know, hip hop is just a clone of itself. You know, Two Live Crew or Public Enemy were fantastic and revolutionary. That was 28, 30 years ago. Nothing new is happening, and all it is people, you know, bragging on how many fucking Maseratis they got. So I mean, I'm not saying that Springsteen is still relevant because, you know, there's nothing around, but I'm saying that the biggest crisis we have right now is a cultural crisis. And let me try and explain it a little deeper. There is an amazing book by an English neuroscientist called The Master and the Emissary. And the thesis of the book is that the left brain and the right brain are actually in a constant battle for domination, and that at various different times in history, left brain, that is Elon Musk, Trump, those types dominate. They're often near autistic.
Don't leave our friend Peter Thiel out, John.
Peter Thiel is left brain as can be. So is Mark Zuckerberg. So is Mark Andreessen. Everybody I wrote about in my last book.
And Bill Gates, of course.
Yeah, they're all on the spectrum. And they're all people that have no sense of empathy, and they're just mechanical, scientifically oriented people. And the right brain, which flourished in the 60s, which is romantic, which is empathetic, which is believing in hope and peace and change and all that, has been pushed down because all anybody wants to do is train people to be left brain people. And I know that at being at a university. All the money flows into the engineering school, and the humanities are completely starved for cash and for resources. And so it could be that we're just in this left brain age, and eventually we'll get out of it. But for this time, that's what's happening. And it doesn't make for great creativity. It basically flushes out all the possibilities of real innovation and creativity in the arts. It may make for some interesting scientific experiments in artificial intelligence, but the very fact that these people actually think that machines should be making music, the machines should be writing books, the machines should be doing journalism, is sad. I have no other way of saying it. And look, Yuval Harari says that the great thing that distinguished Homo sapiens and rose us above all the other mammals and the Neanderthals and everything was our ability to tell stories. Our ability to imagine things that were outside of reality. That's the creative arts. That's what made us interesting and different. And I'm going to argue in my new book that American exceptionalism has nothing to do with political power. It has to do with creative cultural power. And right now, we're in a cultural desert. There's no other way to look at it. There's nothing important really being done. I mean, look, occasionally you get a breakthrough like Oppenheimer or something like that. Or occasionally, you know, Beyonce does one song that will last 25 years from now. But in general, none of it passes the who cares test.
John, some people are going to be watching or listening to this and thinking, oh, he's just an old white guy who's bitter. He can't forget the 1960s. He knew Dylan, he knew George Harrison, he knew the Beatles, and he's become entrenched, archaic. How would you respond to that critique?
Okay, first off, I'm not bitter. I have a great life. I live in an awesome paradise.
But you write angry books about...
Well, I write angry books because I'm angry with Peter Thiel, and I'm angry with Elon Musk because I think they're taking us in an incredibly dangerous direction. They don't believe in humans. They believe that we should meld ourselves with a computer. And I don't believe that's a future that I want my children or my grandchildren to live in. And so I'm not bitter. I mean, look, I go on Apple Music and listen to their recommendations of new tunes every damn week. And I must tell you, it's pretty thin gruel. Now, I occasionally hear wonderful stuff in little corner niches like the Americana music that Rhiannon Giddens is making, or stuff that T-Bone Burnett is making, or you know, stuff like that. And you know, Molly Tuttle is 23 years old, and she's one of the greatest guitar players I ever heard. So, I mean, it's not like I'm saying there's nothing there. I'm just saying in general, we're in a cultural desert. And until someone shows me some examples where I'm really wrong, that's my story and I'm sticking to it.
So what has become then in this cultural desert, as you put it? What has become of right-brain people? Are they doing internet startups? Are they working on digital gaming? Are they opening restaurants? Are they just giving up and going to live in Vietnam?
Okay, you just tipped me to one interesting thing, which is this, that I don't think it's a total cultural desert in the sense that I have a friend who writes cookbooks, Peter Kaminsky, and he is constantly turning me on to really innovative young chefs who have little tiny restaurants in New York or Bar Harbor, Maine, or other places where they're doing innovative cuisine. So that's interesting. But what I'm in general saying is that the algorithmic culture has a way of just posting the hits. In other words, when Bob Dylan's first record came out, it sold 4,000 copies. That's all. You know? So if you have a culture in which, if you're trying to find new music and the algorithm is constantly pushing you stuff that either you already like or you already know about or whatever, it's not healthy. And the evidence is the following. The whole period that I was in the entertainment business in the, say, 65 through 2000, or even 65 through 1998, there was what we call the Pareto curve, that is the 80-20 rule. So that a music company or a movie company would make 80% of their profits on 20% of their output. Today in the music business, the big companies make 90% of their profit off 1% of their output. Taylor Swift, Beyonce, Jay-Z, the big hits just take up everything. Take up all the oxygen and everything. Now, what is it going to need to create a new renaissance? Well, what if Melinda French Gates and Mackenzie Scott, the widows of the two biggest billionaires in the world,
and the Jobs woman as well.
What if instead of putting just their money into politics, what if they said, we're going to revive the culture. We're going to finance little niche, cool stuff, whether it's theater, whether it's movies, whatever it is. With the kind of money they have, you could create a renaissance. You literally could. It would not be hard.
Well, Laura Powell Jobs is already doing that with The Atlantic.
She's the closest one to do it. She's the closest one, but there needs to be more. And it's still too politically oriented. That's the problem. The Atlantic is very political. I'm saying what we need, I'm saying our biggest problem is cultural. It's not political. And you know, the famous thing is culture eats strategy for breakfast every morning. You know, that famous business saying.
The most passionate you've got in this conversation so far has been over the death of Bobby Kennedy, who was, of course, the quintessential politician, not the most cultured man.
He was deeply involved in culture, in the sense that he understood. I mean, I could read you a speech he gave.
Only after his brother died.
No, but he gave a speech in '68 on the campaign about measuring GDP. I don't have it in front of me, but it's. You should put it into your thing, because he said GDP doesn't measure anything that's important.
Fair enough. John, you noted earlier the culture of young people. You taught for a number of years at USC, so you've had a lot of experience with younger people, the younger generation. What's your sense, not of the broader cultural situation, but of their culture? Are you in the woke camp? Are you troubled by the intolerance of younger people these days? Is that a difference between today and perhaps some of the demonstrations over Gaza and the demonstrations against Vietnam in the 60s?
Well, you know, I do believe in free speech. So I do think the notion that shutting down someone who's giving a talk because you don't agree with their politics is probably a big mistake, and it's certainly something that universities should not support. And so I would think that the role of the university is to be a place where dialogue happens. And this notion is, I don't like to hear what you have to say, and I don't want to hear it, or I feel threatened by reading this book, or something like that. I have a hard time buying into that. And you know, I also know that some of the works of art that I think are the most precious are under contemporary standards, misogynist, sexist. I mean, Hemingway, Muddy Waters, I'm a man, you know. I mean, this stuff is not gonna pass the culture police, but it was great work, you know. So I don't understand that, judging works of the 20s and 30s by, you know, standards of the 2020s.
But what about the mental makeup of younger people? Jonathan Haidt has a best-selling book, Our Age of Anxiety. He blames much of this on social media. Is there a shift in the, not just the mentality, the cultural or political mentality, but the mental health of generations? Do you see a big difference between the generation you grew up with in the 60s and today's young people, who seem increasingly afflicted by what appears to be a plague of bad mental health?
Yeah. Well, look, as you know, I've written 2 books about it. I think social media is a totally destructive force. But I would go farther. There is a psychological construct called locus of control. And the basic idea of locus of control is, if you have an internal locus of control, you feel like you're in control of your life. You can make things happen. You take responsibility for your work, whatever. But increasingly, more and more people have an external locus of control. In other words, they believe their life is controlled by external forces, by fate, by that it's all, or as Trump says, a racket. That the world is a racket, and you unless you're on the inside, you have no ability to function. And so this leads people to believe in conspiracy theories, and it also leaves a lot of kids to feel like they're not in control of their lives. And that's why, as Jonathan Haidt shows, the suicide statistics or the self-harm statistics, especially with young women, you know, teenagers, is horrible. It's off the charts. And there's no other thing you can point to except social media and the smartphone. So, you know, as long as people believe that, you know, there are these malicious external forces controlling their lives, we're pretty screwed.
Final couple of questions, John. You've been wonderfully patient here, very generous with your time. America will, of course, be celebrating its 250th anniversary of independence of the Republic in 2026. 2 questions on this. Firstly, will you be celebrating? How will you feel about the 250th year anniversary of your country? And secondly, what would you like to see achieved in the next 50 years, between 26 and 76?
So, the basic ideas that were put forth 250 years ago are actually brilliant. The founders, and to my mind, specifically Thomas Jefferson, were the greatest synthesis of artistic creativity and political common sense that have ever been brought to this earth. If you think of Jefferson, he was an architect, he was a musician, he was an artist, an inventor, but he was also constructed these ideas, especially around the Declaration, that are extraordinary, that ring true to us now. And as Lincoln said, you know, there was no reason for him to put all men are created equal into the Declaration other than as a gift to future generations. He was aware that he wasn't going to make that possible, but he wanted to have an aspirational idea. So I will celebrate the 250th thing, and my biggest celebration was this. The system that Jefferson wanted to create, and Madison as well, was notionally called federalism, in which the states were independent as to things internal to themselves and were united in terms of everything that is external to the United States. In other words, that the United States government should be a Treasury Department, a State Department, and a military department. And basically everything else should be left to the states. If we would go back to that design, and I take this because I've studied at the Annenberg Innovation Lab, which I ran for 10 years, innovation in companies. And it's always true that innovation happens at the edges of systems. And that if we don't decentralize this behemoth that we're living in, we're just not going to get anywhere. And besides, we're going to have to figure out some kind of live and let live principles in the future. Because it's very clear to me that there's 45% of the people who don't want women to have abortions, who don't want any restrictions on gun control, who don't want electric cars, who don't want any restrictions on environmental controls. And then there's 50 to 52% of the people who do want all those things. But the 45%, because of the way the Senate is made up, will probably have the power to put through national laws to ban that in the rest of the country. That would be a complete disaster. And so the states have got to assert their right, and California has to assert its right, to continue to ban assault weapons, to continue to have the cleanest car law there is, to continue to give women complete freedom over their bodies, whether it's in contraception or abortion or whatever, you know, and if we don't have that, we're going to have a civil war, and that would be tragic.
He's an expert.